Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 315. This week the questions are taken from Guide 390 to the French aircraft carrier Bearn, the Wednesday video regarding the USS Tide being mined off of the Normandy beaches just after D-Day, and the Friday video on frigate duels in the War of 1812, a USS President versus HMS Endymion. So let's get on with questions. Josh Thomas Moore asks, we've never had a real ship called Thunderchild, but what are the closest names real warships have come to Thunderchild? Well, obviously the Royal Navy has had a number of names very similar, so there's been a number of HMS Thunderers. In fact, there was an HMS Thunderer at the time that H.G. Wells wrote War of the Worlds, and there would be another one shortly thereafter. There's also been several Thunderbolts, and there's also been an HMS Stormcloud or two. Surprisingly enough, the Danish Navy also gets involved in nearby names because they had an actual torpedo ram called Tordenskjold, I think that's how you pronounce it anyway, which translates to Thundershield, I think, again, roughly speaking. Shandel Lord Shandel asks, how would Bearn compare to Eagle if she'd been converted with only turbines instead of vertical triple expansion engines and turbines? Unfortunately, probably still not particularly well. The turbine would have made the having extra turbines instead of the vertical triple expansion engines would have made the engine rooms a little bit nicer, and potentially at higher speeds would have done her a little bit more of a favour, but ultimately she has still an inferior length to beam ratio compared to Eagle, so even before you look at underwater hull forms, theoretically she shouldn't go as fast, and she's also short about, well, depending on which way you're calculating it, 20 to 25% the power of Eagle. So Eagle has roughly 50,000 shaft horsepower, Bearn has approximately 40,000 shaft horsepower, although it's in French cheval force, which is very slightly different, but essentially if you're multiplying up, she needs 25% extra power compared to what she's got to match Eagle, or Eagle, if you're taking Eagle's 50,000 shaft horsepower as a basis, Bearn has 20% less. So I don't think it's really going to change all that much, unless, as well as using turbines instead of vertical triple expansion engines, perhaps they also rearrange the machinery space to take advantage of the slightly smaller footprint of the turbines in order to maybe stick another boiler or two in to try and put the power up a little. Warrant Officer Will asks, had USS United States been completed, how long do you think she would have been in service? Would she have outlasted the Midways, or would she have been gone relatively soon? I think it depends on what effect her being completed actually has on how the US Navy governs its aircraft carriers, and also obviously which version of her gets completed, because they did have obviously a locked-in version that had its keel laid down, but there was enough argument going on, there is a possibility things might have changed. But if we assume they went with the 54 fighter and dozen or so bomber version, which was ultimately the one they arrived at, I can see this going one of three ways. Way one would be the shortest. So they launch her, they equip her with some kind of nuclear-capable large bomber, but ultimately she doesn't lead to anything further. So for whatever reason, the US Navy decides actually as a concept it's not really working out, and that's kind of a dead end for the large strategic bomber carrying aircraft carrier. At which point, when they eventually get on to building whatever, Forrestal equivalent they would eventually construct thereafter as a more conventional carrier, then the United States would probably last in service about as long as the bombers she carried were considered a viable attack craft, and then probably would have gone at that point. Option 2 would be that she actually does change the way the US Navy thinks about aircraft carriers and the way everyone else perceives them, and you actually get a full attack carrier and nuclear bomber strike carrier split, and she has successors built, in which case she would probably hang around for quite a while as, you know, the originator, and basically as long as she can carry heavy bombers, as obviously they would be increasing in capability and size, at which point, yeah, she would probably last as long as most of the Midways. Whether she'd last exactly as long as USS Midway herself in service is another matter, but she would be around for a while. The third option is kind of a split down the middle, which would be that she is launched. She doesn't really change the way the US sees carriers operating. So the idea of a nuclear strategic bomber carrier is seen as a dead end. But in a sort of a different split from the first option, instead what they do is they look at it and go, well, you know what, we've got a near 70,000 ton normal displacement carrier. It would be a bit dumb of us to get rid of it relatively soon. And so around about the same time they're considering the first big refits for Midway, they probably use her as a test bed for angled flight deck refits and so forth. And then when they take the United States in, and at this point they'll probably already have the Forestals in service, so they'll probably even combine some of the knowledge from the Forestals as well, they might then take her in probably around about the end of the service life of her bombers, and then maybe convert her, because as a normal carrier she does have a couple of fairly big glaring weaknesses, the lack of any substantial island being one of them. But ultimately she would still be, assuming the Forestals and Kitty Hawks were built roughly along the same lines as they were historically, she would still be the single largest conventional aircraft carrier ever built. Only Enterprise would exceed her in chronological terms, at least as far as the US Navy is concerned, obviously. So she could be taken in at that point and converted to a conventional carrier, so they'd have to strip away some of the stuff on the starboard side to fit an island, and obviously convert the bomber hangar, or whichever hangar they were using for bomber parts and maintenance, depending if they're storing bombers on deck, partially on deck, partly below, whatever, but essentially convert her into a true regular carrier. So island installation, rework the starboard side, put in a nice big angle flight deck on the other side, and at that point you'd actually have a theoretically pretty darn capable conventional aircraft carrier. What you might even find is that the fighter hangar stays as a fighter hangar, and maybe once she's relaunched you'll see stuff like F4 Phantoms and F8 Crusaders. They're all in the fighter section, and your A4s and your A7s and later on your S3s and E2s and so forth are all stuck in the other section, the bit that used to hold the bombers, and they just keep a split that way. So, you know, fighters and small strike aircraft, maybe the A4s as well, I guess, get stuck in the front hangar, and all the bombers and miscellaneous stuff get stuck in the rear hangar. And then at that point she'd probably outlast Midway, because as a refit, as said, she would be the single largest conventional aircraft carrier, so she probably would last well into the 21st century in operational service, because the Kitty Hawk and Forrestal classes would probably, actually, assuming nothing went wrong with their machinery, probably exit service before her, because she'd be more capable of operating larger aircraft, like F-14s and FA-18s. Benjamin Stout asks, Bearn was too slow to be effective as an aircraft carrier, along with various other issues. What is the sweet spot speed a carrier must achieve to best support flight operations, and how has that speed changed over time? Well, if we restrict ourselves to carrier speed in terms purely of flight ops, rather than the ability to get away from enemy attacking cruisers and so forth, the sweet spot speed for flight operations essentially amounts to two major things. Firstly, can you catch up in a reasonable amount of time with your battle line or your fleet in general after you've broken off to conduct air operations? That requires a certain measure of speed advantage, which unfortunately Bearn did not have. I would suggest you probably want at least a comfortable 3 to 4 knot clearance over your battle line speed, ideally more. So in the early interwar period, that would be 24 to 25 knots if you were a British or American carrier, 26 to 27 knots if you were a Japanese carrier. And of course, as time goes on, that speed is going to increase. Now, you don't necessarily design a carrier that's going to massively exceed the speed of cruisers. So putting a 3 to 4 knot speed advantage over your heavy and light cruisers would require a carrier capable of going, in most cases, 37 to 40 knots, and if you're taking some of the slightly quicker Japanese cruisers, potentially even faster, that's just going to be ridiculous. But by the end of the 1930s, with fast battleships coming into service, then I would argue, from the standpoint of keeping up with the fleet, if you've had to break off to conduct air ops, you want at least a speed of 30 to 31 knots, if not more, because your average battleship speed for new ships is 27 to 28 knots. So ideally 31 plus, you could maybe just about get away with 30. The other element when it comes to purely flight ops is the speed of the wind over the deck. Obviously you turn into the wind and you hopefully will have a headwind that can help, but you have to plan for potentially completely still wind, and the only wind you're generating over the deck is the speed that you're traveling at. Now, obviously, that is going to increase incrementally over time, because at the beginning of the 20s, aircraft didn't need all that much room to take off. I mean, you look at the stacked flight decks you get on Courageous and Glorious and Akagi and Kaga. You could take off in a very short distance, and indeed you still could take off in a fairly short distance even in the Second World War, even if that's increased somewhat. But as aircraft are getting heavier and heavier, they're needing more and more air over their wings to get airborne, and they're needing longer and longer run-ups to get up to that kind of speed. And obviously the speed that you can provide by sailing at full speed as the carrier is going to mitigate against that. And all of that is going to dictate not only what kind of aircraft you can operate off of your carrier, but also how much weight you can put on those aircraft. So, for example, you can operate an Avenger off of an escort carrier, but you can put substantially more weight on an Avenger that you can operate off of a good majority of the flight deck length on an Essex class fleet carrier than you can an Avenger that's got to make do with, let's say, 3/4 the length of an escort carrier's flight deck. Plus you have the extra lift of the fact the Essex can break 30 knots very comfortably, whereas the escort carrier is tootling around at 18 to 20 knots, therefore you're going to get less lift. So I would argue that given the overall increases in both size and weight of the aircraft and size and weight of the payloads that the aircraft could take, you're probably looking at a curve with a relatively gentle slope through the 20s and early 30s, but then once you start to get into monoplane aircraft and bigger dive bombs, like 1,000-pounders on Dauntlesses and so forth, by the end of the 1930s, you're seeing that speed sweet spot, minimum price of entry, probably rising quite quickly. So you might start off with 24, 25 knots being your combined sweet spot in the interwar period in the 20s, and maybe by 1933 it's still only maybe 26, 27 knots. But from 33, 34 onwards, the minimum price of entry sweet spot is probably going up very quickly from that to 30 to 31, 32 knots by the start of the Second World War. Paladion asks, let's say the French fleet stationed in North Africa had taken the go to your country's overseas colonies and stay there as long as the Vichy regime is in power option offered by the British in July 1940. Did France's overseas assets even have the necessary infrastructure to welcome and maintain some of the largest ships? I can't imagine the latest French battleships like Dunkirk or Richelieu faring any better than Bearn in the Caribbean. Where could they have gone with any hope of staying up and in shape besides North Africa? Well, Dakar, in what's now Senegal, probably would be the best bet. Yes, obviously going to the Caribbean, there really isn't the infrastructure to support the entire force de raid. Force de raid apparently actually forced to raid. In any case, yeah, aside from Mers el Kabir itself, I think Dakar would be probably the best place for the French fleet to head. They already had stockpiles of ammunition ready for Dunkirk and Strasbourg. That historically got modified for use in Richelieu while she was there, and Richelieu headed there in the aftermath of the fall of France. It's also relatively close, so it's not too far from Mers el Kabir, but it's far enough, I think, that the French could probably say to the British, look, we potentially don't necessarily have all the fuel to get there, to the Caribbean that is, and we don't have the facilities to maintain our ships there. However, if we go to Dakar, well, there are already British ships in Dakar, and even if the armistice forces us to ask those ships to leave, it's far enough away that the British can establish a sort of blockade, or at least an eye-watching patrol, without being at any particular risk of attack from the Germans, and there'll be plenty of notice if the French did try to sail, and if they need to, as I said, they have stockpiles to keep their ships maintained, at least for a while. The other side benefit to all of that is that the governor, the population, and the admiral in charge in the area are also actually much more in favour than most of continuing the fight against the Germans. So if the French forces from Mers el Kabir, as well as obviously Richelieu, all rock up at Dakar, and they sit there for half a year or so to maybe a year, and therefore there isn't an attack on Mers el Kabir, then there's also potentially the chance that over in Alexandria, the French forces there, without the Mers el Kabir issue, might at least partially join the British, and with the long-term influence of a pro-British population in Senegal, there is a reasonable chance that as and when the Germans decide, actually, we're going to take over Vichy France, or possibly even before then, the entire force de raid and Richelieu might just up sticks and go, stuff it, we're getting involved in the war on the Allied side, because, yeah, that would be a really good solution. Nathan Zilla asks, during the World War II timeframe, was any naval or land-based bombing on shipping done using napalm or drop tanks filled with fuel? I'm not aware of any specific deliberate missions where someone went, right, we're heading out on an anti-shipping strike, let's load up with napalm. Because, well, for one thing, napalm, although it was developed in the middle of World War II, wasn't actually used until roughly the last year of World War II, i.e. mid-late 44 onwards. And drop tanks filled with fuel, I mean, if the drop tank has fuel in it, you ideally want to use that fuel, albeit that the use of petrol or gasoline in bombs was kind of realised in part in World War II, because as far as I can recall from one of the books I've read, essentially somebody had a drop tank that still had some fuel in it, and they needed to get rid of the weight along with bombs they were carrying to, evade and get home. So they thought, well, you know what? If nothing else, dropping this big metal object on the enemy will probably do some damage. Dropped it off, and when partially filled tank of aviation fuel detonated, or was detonated potentially by a nearby bomb explosion, they went, that seemed to do an awful lot of damage. Maybe this is a good idea. And off they went. But the thing is, most incendiary bombs were carpet bombing weapons and weren't particularly accurate. And on top of that, of course, there is the whole thing of you sink a ship by letting water in the bottom. And dropping the relatively small incendiary weapons, whether they be thermite bombs, napalm bombs, whatever, on a large target like a ship. Yeah, you might cause a fire to break out, but a fire in the upper works is by far the least of the concerns of a ship that's been bombed. If you could get to the point where you could release a bomb to hit a ship, it's far, far better to either hit it with a much bigger high explosive bomb or potentially with an armor-piercing bomb that will go really nice and deep in the ship and let water in the bottom. So, as I say, not aware of any specific deliberate use, but considering that both napalm and the occasional drop tank were lobbed at various enemy forces on land, it's not entirely out of the question that at some point somebody who happened to have one or both of those around suddenly found themselves diverted onto an anti-shipping mission and went, well, you know what? I've got the stuff, you might as well, and lobbed it at somebody or other with whatever effects that may or may not have had. Of course, the rather interesting other note when it comes to napalm is the fact that one of the people who was working on napalm, when they realized they had the essentially sticky gasoline formula, went, you know what this needs? The addition of white phosphorus. I think they were voted down. Warrant Officer Will asks, what were the major differences when it came to shore bombardment at Normandy versus in the Pacific campaigns? It seems that at D-Day the naval assets were far more hesitant about providing active support in places like Omaha Beach than they were in the Pacific. Why? There's a few reasons. Firstly, the bombardment missions against Japanese-held islands in the Pacific, certainly after the first few, tended to go on for an extremely long period of time. Whereas with the D-Day bombardment, it was a case of, you show up literally the night before and open fire with the dawn. So there's a much shorter period of bombardment before the troops go in and you start having to be a little bit more careful. Another factor is that the Normandy landings, of course, were going into mainland France, which meant that the scope of the area being covered by the bombardments was considerably larger than your average Pacific island landing. If you see some of the footage from the various bombardments on the Pacific islands and atolls, in a lot of cases, you could stand on the deck of the warship doing the bombardment and you could see in a relatively narrow field of view the entire width of the island you were attacking. And with some of the ones that didn't have major promontories, you could potentially see actually across and see the sea behind said island if you were high enough up in the ship, say in one of the spotting positions. And that meant that you could engage a far greater range of targets with far more immediately visible results, as opposed to at Normandy, where initially you've got the beaches, then you've got the cliffs, and then thanks to rolling hills and so forth, targets you're engaging further back you can't really see, hence the need for aircraft spotters and spotters embedded with the troops going ashore. You've also got the fact that on a number of Pacific Island landing spots, not all of them, but a reasonable number, because of the nature of many Pacific Islands being volcanic atolls, there's actually quite a lot of deep water until relatively close offshore, which meant that bombarding ships could get considerably closer safely, as opposed to off the Normandy beaches, which are much more traditional beach and then underwater landscape, combined with the sheer scale of Overlord, which meant that a lot of the larger bombarding vessels had to be somewhat further out than you could get in some of the Pacific landings. And of course that means a slightly greater circular area of probability for your shots, which means you're going to be a lot more hesitant because if you're a mile away, you can almost bore sight your guns in on the target. If you're 2 or 3 miles away, there may be a drift of a few dozen yards, and in a close quarters environment like Omaha, that might mean the difference between hitting at the base of a German fortification or blowing a battalion of your own troops to bits. And to a certain extent, there's also the fact that ultimately the bigger German shore defences tended to be a little bit bigger and a little bit more lethal than the bigger Japanese shore defences on most islands, which made approaching close and slow to get really nice, accurate shore bombardment support shots a little bit more risky off of D-Day, and at least until those fortresses were suppressed. Richard Bennett asks, the close-in fire support from 3 destroyers may have saved the Omaha Beach landings. Who were these extremely bold skippers that drew fire away from the pinned-down troops? And was this ordered by Hewitt or someone higher up, or improvised by the destroyers? It's pretty much improvised by the destroyers, because although they're assigned to close fire support, what exactly the definition of close fire support is has to be left up to the destroyer captains on the scene. There are theoretically Navy guidelines as to how close you can get for close fire support, but of course captains do have a certain amount of latitude in what they're choosing to do. But if you look at some of the higher angle daylight photos of the Omaha Beach as a whole, you'll be able to see from the way, obviously, the colour of the water changes, that the depth off of Omaha Beach not only obviously changes the further out you get, but the rate at which it changes is quite variable. So in June 1944, the eastern end of the beach, you could actually get considerably closer for a given draft than at the western end of the beach, but it's not an even progression. So, someone higher up on a ship further away really is not in a position to say to a destroyer, I want you to close to within 400 yards or whatever and open up, because 400 yards in that particular position might put that ship well ashore long before it gets close enough. And then, of course, you've also got the tidal situation, because how close you can get at high tide versus how close you can get at low tide are, again, going to be 2 very different things. So, as I said, you can tell a destroyer your mission is to provide close fire support, but if the captain, by reading his charts, checking the tidal estimates for the time that he's off the beach and his relative position to the target, he may then be able to choose to go considerably closer, but it is much more at his own risk than anything else. Now, as far as who exactly was involved, well, quite a lot of the destroyers assigned to the Omaha Bombardment Group went in very close. You've got Satterley and Thompson and the British Talibont supporting the assault on Point du Hoc, but I think the ones you're probably referring to are Carmick, McCook and Harding, as they're the ones who went up in the centre of Omaha Beach. 5 other destroyers went to the eastern end of the beach, but since you mentioned 3 and they're sort of dead centre, I think it's Carmick, McCook and Harding that you're looking at. In terms of commanding officers, the commanding officer of USS Carmick was Commander Robert Beer. USS McCook was under the command of Lieutenant Commander Ralph Lester Ramey, spelled R-A-M-E-Y, and USS Harding was commanded by Commander George G. Palmer, spelled P-A-L-M-E-R. Matthew wants to know, when was this interview recorded and how old is Mr. Gardner? He also thanks Mr. Gardner for his service. Mr. Gardner, at the time of the recording, was 99 years old. He may well be 100 by now. And I conducted the interview on the 29th of May, 2024. I do actually have some additional material from that interview, which I intend to put up at some point later in the year, which is to do more so with Mr. Gardner's later career in the US Navy, as opposed to just strictly the D-Day USS Tide operations, which is what we were mostly covering at the time. The man formerly known as Commenting Is What I Do asks, you mentioned that the East India Company's China convoys would have a devastating impact on the British economy if they were attacked and lost. Were these convoys a thing in the American Revolution, and had the Americans or their allies in France and Spain managed to deliver such a blow, what could have happened? There were China convoys, or the East India China Fleet, as it was sometimes called, during the time of the American Revolution. So in theory, it could be attacked. However, there are a couple of things that would mitigate against both an attack being likely and an attack succeeding, and the attack having a significant effect on the British economy. Firstly, during the American Revolution, or the American War of Independence, whatever you want to call it, there's still quite a lot of fighting going on about who is going to control India. And of course that means a foreign, primarily French, presence in the area. And that of course means a much greater Royal Navy presence in the area. And this is coupled with the fact that although the China trade was quite valuable in the 1770s, it was nowhere near as valuable as it would be in the 1810s. And the big change in both investment in cargoes being taken to China and the value of cargoes coming out of China really kicks off in the mid-1780s. The amount of money invested in the China trade goes up between 4 to 6-fold between, say, 1775 and 1785, 1790, and the value of the goods being imported goes up 10-fold. So by the time of the War of 1812, for example, the trade with China is an order of magnitude or more valuable to the East India Company and thus the British Empire than it was in the 1770s. And so a disruption of a financial investment of that scale in the 1810s would be devastating for the British, especially because by the time that we're referring to in the War of 1812, sort of 1814 going into 1815, the British Empire has been fighting the French off and on for longer than a lot of the soldiers and sailors have actually been alive, at which point, yes, the British Empire is the single most wealthy institution on the planet, but it still owes a lot of money, and thus it is in a somewhat more precarious and vulnerable situation when you've got something of that value coming back from China with the East India China fleet. Conversely, although Britain had been at war off and on with Spain, France, and everybody else in the 1770s when America got its independence, it was nowhere near as much in debt, and as I said, the convoy wasn't worth anywhere near as much just generally, and therefore, if America, the Continental Fleet, or the French or the Spanish had gone after the China convoy, firstly, they would have likely been met by considerably more opposition because of the very active naval combat situation over on that trade route, mostly to do with India, whereas by 1813, 1814, whilst there was still combat going on in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific, it was at a much lower tempo than it had been in the 1770s. And if they had then somehow managed to get a force together sufficient to break through the much more increased Royal Navy presence in the area in the 1770s, even if they had captured the China fleet, whilst it would have been pretty bad for the East India Company, as a reflection of the total financial resources of the British Empire, it wouldn't have been anywhere near as bad a hit. Kay Cupsky asks, please talk about drumming signals and what role musicians played on ships. Beside music. Were there really drummers on galleys making the pace? And how were signals used before gunpowder? Were horns and trumpets ever more effective than flags? So, apart from just making music to entertain people, drummers and other musicians actually had a role in making music to encourage people. So, not necessarily during battle itself, although occasionally the odd musician would strike up a tune, but as a ship sailed into battle, quite often various rousing tunes and songs would be played by the ship's musicians to get everybody in a bit of a fighting spirit and raise their spirits a little bit. But when it comes to signals, signaling by drums and trumpets in the era before complex signal flag protocols was very common and the best way of communicating your intentions across the fleet. Now, of course, there were a limited number of signals you could send in this way, but it was considerably more effective than just standing at the back of the ship with a unpowered loudhailer and trying to yell at everybody. You could imagine if the admiral on his flagship says, "Okay, we need to come about and attack the French," and his assistant gets up with his loudhailer and is like, "Oi, you lot, come about and attack the French!" And, half a mile away, somebody trying to hear that over the creak of their sails and so forth. And given that these people have probably been exposed to a lot of cannon fire during their lifetimes, probably not the best at hearing, is going, eh? Round about the hard tack, you'll find a bench? Huh. I guess go below and see what he's on about. Yeah, that's not really going to work in battle, is it? Whereas if you write out a set of instructions to all your captains before, which is pretty much what admirals would do in that time period before codified signals with flags were invented, and you just said, right, well, if you hear one long trumpet blast, that means do this. If you hear two long trumpet blasts, that's do this. If the trumpet goes long, short, long, that means this. Now, of course, this sounds a bit like Morse code. It's not, because Morse code would be invented later on. But you could come up with a reasonable number of instructions based on short and long trumpets blasts, or a little bit of a bugle signal or something like that. And similarly with drums. Now, of course, you can't do a long drum, but you could, for example, do a fast drum beat, which could mean one thing, or you could do a slow, steady boom, boom, boom with your drums, which could mean another thing. And you can mix those up. So you could do a drum roll and a couple of beats, which would mean one thing, or you could have a couple of beats and then a drum roll, which could mean another thing. And the wonderful thing about these is that because they're relatively quick to do, they can also be repeated. So you could do your signal, whatever it happened to be, with your drums or your trumpets or whatever, and then wait 15 seconds and then repeat it. And you could do that, and in the space of a minute, you could repeat that signal several times, which gives a greater chance for everybody to recognize what on earth is going on. And because it's therefore more complex and much more quickly repeatable than firing signal guns, it's actually a relatively effective means of controlling your ships. And of course, unlike flag signals, it's not really disrupted by smoke or fog or night. It just has a somewhat more limited range, because whilst the sound will carry much better than a human voice, it will only carry to a certain extent. And then beyond that, you have to rely on repeaters and so forth. Whereas flag signals, as long as there's decent line of sight in a telescope, can go considerably further. Now, as far as the use of drums in galleys to help rowers keep the pace, that's a little bit of a debated subject. It depends when you're looking at rowed warships. So, for example, if you're looking at the Greek warships in Battle of Salamis and that kind of era, they almost certainly didn't use drums, but they are recorded as having used things like flutes. But really anything that can help you keep time, whether it be a flute, a song, a chant, or perhaps a drum, all of these could be used, although, as we said, drums don't seem to have been used on the Greek vessels. Probably not so much on Roman vessels, although the Roman land military did make use of drums. The use of drums on medieval galleys is a little bit better established, but even there, it's not a universal thing. So, essentially, roughly speaking, the further forward in time you get, the greater the chances are you'll find a rowing ship with a drum aboard, which may be used to help the oarsmen all keep pace, but there are a lot of other options available. Brian Smith asks, what kind of decisions are made as to the placement of torpedo tubes on surface ships, midship versus stern versus bow? There's a lot of factors to consider, but some of them include things like, what is the role of the ship? So, for example, if you are making a torpedo boat or a torpedo cruiser or a torpedo ram or something like that, then the idea of having a bow-mounted torpedo tube is going to be a lot more attractive than, say, a stern-mounted tube, because those kinds of ships are supposed to be charging headlong at the enemy, so you want the torpedoes roughly where you're going to be pointing. And this is talking about torpedo tubes actually built into ships as opposed to deck-mounted torpedo launchers, which mostly can swing around. Conversely, if you are expecting to fight more in a battle line, or you're going to use your torpedoes as finishing shots or in passing in a mass melee, so perhaps if you're an armoured cruiser or a battleship, then midships torpedo tubes make a bit more sense. There's also a degree of where do you have space, because of course a bow tends to be relatively fine. You might not have the space for a torpedo tube there, and if you're planning on moving at particularly high speeds with a large ship, you might have quite a lot of force of water being exerted on your bow, at which point having an underwater bow torpedo tube could be problematic, and even having some of the above water ones that you see on 1890s, early 1900s ships could also have issues in terms of keeping the watertight seal on when you don't want to use it, and when you open it, having, you know, random bow spray coming up into it in varying amounts may affect how that torpedo can actually be launched. Also, depending on the era of the torpedo, because the torpedo might not actually be that much faster than the ship that's launching it in a straight line, and the last thing you want to do is run over your own torpedo. And similarly, for space considerations, with there not being much room in the bow, you might not have a lot of room for reloads, whereas amidships, you tend to have a lot more volume, and if you want to be firing quite a few torpedoes, then, of course, that makes more sense. The flip side to that is, as you can see here, you would be launching your torpedo perpendicular to the flow of water, which means you have to come up with some way of not having your torpedo immediately dragged off course, which is, well, actually that's what this sticking out arm is for on this particular photo. With a stern-mounted torpedo tube, this could be, again, something that you might have for just all-round effort if you're expecting, you know, torpedo tubes in the bow, stern, and amidships. As gyroscopic guidance gets a little bit more reliable, obviously the exact position of a torpedo tube becomes slightly less important, but it is still somewhat important because you're still talking about arcs of fire rather than 360 fire. But particularly with stern tubes, really all you've got, although it's quite important in the stern, is the rudder assemblage and the steering gear, because the propeller shafts, etc., are going to be really deep in the ship. So in the overhanging stern section is probably where you're going to find the most, not unused space, but the most easily converted space. So if you're emphasizing protection elsewhere, and of course torpedo tubes are an underwater penetration weakness for blast, well then in the stern it's slightly less of an issue. And on capital ships, especially, again, if you're viewing them as either coup de grace weapons or potentially something you might fire to dissuade pursuit by various enemy warships of different sizes, then a stern torpedo tube might make a bit more sense. Kind of a sting in the tail. Greb asks, in Master and Commander, you read about using pulleys and yard arms and capstans to lift heavy objects. I was wondering about dockyard cranes in the Age of Sail. Can you tell us a little about those? So in the Age of Sail, you're essentially looking at two main types of crane. At the smaller end of things, so for lifting things like cannon or perhaps some of the heavier bits of ship's timber when you're building a ship, you'd be looking at treadmill cranes. And these are almost entirely, well, for obvious reasons, made of wood, but they might be portable or they might be semi-portable, as in you could dismantle them, move them to a new location and reassemble them there, and some of the larger ones might be fixed. These, generally speaking, look like somewhat blocky wooden versions of the type of general purpose harbour crane you might see in a modern dockyard or dry dock, but their ability to raise up at the main beam up and down was either non-existent or relatively limited compared to these days. And obviously, clues in the name, powered by a treadmill or two. Their main benefit was that they could rotate. So you would establish them, you'd have your load, whatever it was, on the dock side. It would rotate, pick it up, and then it would rotate over to the ship and lower it down again. So they have a given arc. So that's for your more general purpose loads. For the really heavy stuff, or really tall stuff, especially when it came to putting masts into ships, you would use a shear crane. Now that could take the two forms, but essentially is pretty much the same principle. A dockyard shear or a shear hulk, and a shear hulk is what's pictured on screen at the moment. And what this effectively is a form of A-frame, as you can see, anchored into something. Now, on a dockyard shear, the A-frame would be anchored into a building, and generally this would not move. Pretty much the same with a shear hulk. I mean, you could move the shear hulk itself around, but unlike a treadmill crane, they wouldn't really usually rotate at all. They would be fixed position cranes. So if you're bringing a mast in for a ship, you'd have to bring something carrying the mast under the shear, which would then pick it up, and then that would move out of the way, and the ship needing the mast would be put in place. These could, to a certain degree, move up and down, or more accurately, back and forth. But again, it would depend on the crane installation, but that was a little bit more common than with the treadmill cranes. And the reason for that is because, as you can see with the shear hulk, the whole thing's anchored to the main mast of the shear hulk and obviously into the ship itself, or the hulk in this case. And on a dockyard side one, it would be anchored into the building and then into the ground. And pretty much by the same kind of system as you would use the yard arms and capstans on a ship to move stuff around, you would similarly use such devices on the shear hulk or on the dockyard shear to raise and lower whatever heavy object it was that you were picking up, usually a mast, and then put it back down again when the relevant ship was underneath it. Rebel Skverl asks, instead of building Nelson and Rodney as they were historically, would the Royal Navy have been better off under the conditions of the naval treaties by building them as improved hoods, allowing these three fast ships to share flagship duties and rotate into the shipyards for refit on a timely basis prior to the Second World War starting? Under the terms of the Washington Naval Treaty, no, simply because building 2 additional improved hoods would be in violation of that treaty because of their displacement. Hood was way above the 35,000 ton limit. She was kind of ignored as a sort of grandfathered in existing and at the time very new ship. And also because, as I've mentioned before, when the US Navy saw her, they evaluated her combat-wise as roughly on a par with a Colorado-class battleship. Obviously, Hood was faster, but the Colorado was more heavily armed and slightly more heavily protected. And so, by the US Navy's calculation systems, they roughly equated the two, and when you had Colorado, Maryland, and West Virginia under consideration for construction, what seems to have happened is the US Navy kind of went, well, if we roughly equate Hood to a Colorado and the Brits are asking for parity, well, that means they can have 2 more 16-inch ships. And indeed, the British obviously seem to have agreed, which is why they asked for 2 16-inch ships to have parity with the Americans as opposed to 3, because if they'd asked for 3 Nelsons, the Americans would have said, well, yeah, what about Hood, though? That's unfair. But although you can get away with that as a grandfathered-in ship, if you had the British then turning around saying, well, instead of building a pair of 16-inch ships, we want to build another pair of very well over 40,000-ton battle cruisers, no, the Americans and the Japanese are not going to stand for that, because at that point there'd be arguments about, well, why can't we complete a Lexington or an Amagi or all sorts of things. So unfortunately, under the treaty terms, you're not going to get it, and you can't really, in 1922, scale down Hood's design in any appreciable manner to get something that could realistically be called an improved Hood on 35,000 tons. Now, granted, you could make a 35,000-ton ship armed with 15-inch guns with Hood's inclined 12-inch belt armor, perhaps revised to an all-or-nothing layout, and it would be a relatively swift vessel, faster than 23 knots, but you'd be probably looking at something in the region of maybe 25 to 27 knots. So maybe approaching what in the Second World War would be called fast battleship terms, with obviously slightly reduced armor protection and 1 less gun than the average fast battleship. But still, compared to the speed of Hood herself, it would be difficult to judge those as improved. And of course, if you want a 35,000-ton, 15-inch armed battle cruiser, well, that's kind of F3. So that loops us back round to the idea that perhaps F3 would have been the better design in hindsight to adopt instead of Nelson and Rodney. And although F3 obviously being an all-forward triple-turreted ship is nothing like Hood in terms of overall design style, she is still a battle cruiser, and you can see some of the improvements to protection, certainly, that you could squeeze out of that by using that layout as opposed to the two twin aft that you get on Hood, albeit, of course, at the sacrifice of some speed, because F3 is not going to be winning any races with Hood anytime soon. With that aside, assuming by some magical hand-wavy force that Japan and America somehow allow the Brits to complete 2 improved Hoods, or to probably more likely just build 2 improved Hoods, considering that the Admiral class had already been scrapped by the time of the Washington Naval Treaty, that is the other 3. Well, the utility of an improved Hood design compared to the Nelson and Rodney is arguable. I mean, yes, you've got the speed, which is great, but I think I would argue that unless there were some rather radical revisions, such as adopting all or nothing armor and some of the other design finagles that you get from downscaling the G3s to Nelson and Rodney, which at that point you start to look at, you're starting to look at a ship that may be improved Hood in name only. It might vaguely resemble Hood, but design-wise would actually be a rather different beast apart from armament. That could make a degree of logical sense, because a decently protected pair of battle cruisers - fast battleships to accompany Hood would relieve the pressure on Hood, and it would give the Royal Navy a 5-ship strong fast ship squadron, because you'd have the 2 improved Hoods, Hood and Renown and Repulse, which would certainly help when the era of fast battleships comes along, because you can, Hood could go in for a refit a little bit more often, perhaps get updated fire control, and these other 2 ships would, taking the place of Nelson and Rodney, would get the next generation of fire control already. Texas and LaShock asks, what are the protocols for flying flags on warships before they're commissioned? I'm assuming that they fly their nation's flag, but they won't have any naval ensigns or jacks. Is that right? It does vary somewhat by navy and time period, but generally speaking, a ship should not have an ensign hoisted unless it is actively under somebody's command. There is also the commissioning pennant, which of course cannot be flown on a ship prior to its commissioning, but occasionally ships that are under construction might fly its flags on special occasions before their completion and commissioning. So, for example, while the ship is initially under construction, it's not going to be flying any flags. There may be flags draped on the cranes or on the shipyard if they want to be particularly patriotic, but not on the ship itself. Apart from anything, there isn't really anywhere suitable to hoist a flag on a ship that's significantly under construction. But come launch day, very often one or more flags of the Navy, the nation, and various other flags may be flown on the ship's hull as it is launched for, obviously, ceremonial occasions. You can see here the Shikishima being launched. It has the Japanese rising sun flag of the time right there at the back, and a bunch of other flags there as well. And if you look at, say, the launch of King George V, she has a white ensign on her stern at the time of launch. Now, when the ship is fitting out, this is where variation comes in. On some ships, a captain will be assigned to supervise the fitting out, and his notional time in command may start from the day of launch, at which point, although the ship is not commissioned, there is a captain in command and therefore technically also a crew, so it is appropriate for the ship to have an ensign flying during the daytime, with colours, etc., as would any other warship. However, in some other navies, a captain and at least a partial crew may not be assigned on launch day. They may be assigned later on during the fitting out process. And so in those cases, if a ship has launched with its national ensign flying and some other flags, it might not display that ensign or flag subsequently until such time as either a captain and crew comes aboard or it is commissioned. And again, this practice varies depending on the Navy, because sometimes a crew will be assigned but not a captain. And as we said, it could be from launch, it could be from partway through the fitting out process, or in some navies at some time periods, the captain and crew might not really come aboard and take over the ship until pretty much the commissioning time. A lot of it will also depend on, is the ship being used for trials before being accepted as a commissioned ship, or is it being commissioned first and then taken on trials? Because obviously if it's being taken out on trials, then it is going to need a crew and a captain, and that means it's also going to need to have an ensign and a flag. So there is a lot of stuff that is actually quite variable at the time between launch and full commissioning as to what flags it can fly and when, with the main one that's absolutely definitive is that you cannot fly your commissioning pennant until you have actually commissioned. BB63 Veteran asks, why didn't the first attack group off of Midway radio back that they've spotted 4 carriers? That message could then have been received by the 3 US carriers, and Hornet's attack group wouldn't go wandering off to do a weather check. Simply put, they didn't spot 4 carriers, or at least a good majority of them didn't, and a lot of the ones that did were either extremely busy with being shot at or being shot down, and therefore not in a position to make a report, and the few survivors that were left were more concerned with getting back to Midway and, landing safely. You'd be surprised how much tunnel vision can occur, because although the Japanese carriers were operating in a loose 4-ship formation, there was still a fair bit of distance between them. And so when the attacks go in and the Japanese fighters are attacking them, the Japanese anti-aircraft gunners are attacking them, their comrades are going down in flames left, right and centre, a lot of the pilots who would in the end survive at all to be in a position to report would just be looking at, okay, there's the target, how do I get to the target, and then how do I get away from the target? And if there's another carrier or 2 or 3 halfway to the horizon, you genuinely are probably not going to notice, and even if you do, you're not going to be paying attention to their exact form long enough to determine, yes, well, this is clearly a carrier as opposed to a battleship or a cruiser. Because, if they're miles away and you're a couple of thousand feet up in the air and descending rapidly, it's mostly a large blob with a wake attached to it, not really a distinguishable ship unless you take time to maybe look through binoculars or whatever, and that is not something you're going to be doing with lots of anti-aircraft shells and Zeros coming after you. And so I suspect that pretty much the contingent that attacked wasn't really aware that there were 4 carriers. They had attacked Japanese aircraft carriers, but bear in mind, even scouting recon aircraft that spotted the Japanese fleet and weren't under quite as significant stress, even they were only reporting, say, 2 carriers and so forth. The other thing to bear in mind is that although Midway launches its attack aircraft first, apart from a few initial attacks, a good chunk of Midway's aircraft attack after Hornet and Enterprise have begun to launch their own aircraft. So even if they had radioed in the aftermath of their attack and gone, hey guys, there are 4 Japanese carriers at this position, well, at that point, Hornet and Enterprise's aircraft have actually already gone off and started on their own courses. Plus, you've also got the fact that, yes, you may have spotted 4 carriers, and yes, intel may suggest the Japanese are coming with 4 carriers, but you also know for a fact the Japanese have Shikaku and Zuikaku. You don't necessarily know that the Japanese haven't brought them, and therefore Hornet's air group may decide that to go off and do its own thing anyway. And, that's assuming that the survivors from the later Midway-based strikes radio back to Midway, Midway tells the carriers then tell the pilots, and the pilots receive and understand the instructions and can act on them. And just to emphasize, when you're focused, just how much tunnel vision can be a thing. At the time that you're listening to this, it will have been, a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, because I'm recording ahead of time, because obviously I'm going to the States. But at the time that I'm recording this, a couple of days ago, the timing belt on my people carrier exploded and took the engine with it, which was fun because now you're on a motorway going at 70 miles an hour with zero power, and you've just got to coast on inertia to get into a safe area. Yeah, that's fun when you've got your wife and baby aboard. And yes, with a completely dead engine, it needs an engine replacement. That's going to be a very expensive job. But anyway, the point I was getting at is that when the vehicle got home, it was trucked home, I then had to have it towed to a garage to get it assessed and repaired. In order to be towed, that meant I had to be in the dead vehicle and steer it with the tow. And I worked out, in order to keep formation on the vehicle ahead, I was staring actually at a CCTV camera symbol that happened to be in the right position on the back door of the towing vehicle. Now, I locked onto that, and I was just like, okay, I'm looking dead ahead, and as long as I keep that in my dead ahead field of view, I'm in line with the vehicle. I'm not stressing the tow bar too much. I know the route that we took because that's a route I regularly drive to visit other things that are in and around the garage that the vehicle was going to. But I tunnel visioned on that symbol so much just to focus on keeping the car aligned that I barely even was able to perceive the brake lights coming on the towing vehicle, because obviously then I had to brake as well, let alone what was going on the sidewalk or pavement as it is in the UK, or the other lanes around me, unless we were stopped and I was looking around deliberately. And okay, trying to control a near 3-ton people carrier that has no power steering or power-assisted braking or anything is a relatively stressful situation, but I'd rather suspect trying to fly an Avenger or a B-26 whilst half the Kito-Bataillon's combat air patrol is trying to blow you out of the sky is probably somewhat more stressful, at which point you can't really fault the pilots for not noticing however many Japanese carriers might be 3, 4, 5 miles away from the one they're going for. And finally for this week, Dr. D.M. Platt asks, you frequently ask people to add additional information in the comments on topics in which you are inexpert. Which resulting discussions did you find the most informative? Without picking on any single individual discussion, I think the ones I find the most informative are probably fall into 2 brackets. One of which is where there's a subject where, as you know, I'll say, look, I don't know a huge amount about this. If you do, please let us know in the comments below. And somebody responds with either I did this, or I do this, or my father or grandfather did this. Yeah, someone with either first or very close second-hand experience of what exactly it is that we were talking about, because not only does that obviously bring a degree of expertise to the discussion specifically, because someone's actually done this or knows someone who has, but it also brings in the human element, which can enhance understanding beyond just reading technical specifications. So actually, although a good example actually would be the Titanic engine stop or engine reverse scene, which was questioned in a recent dry dock. Now, I read a period account of how to reverse vertical triple expansion engines, and in part it was worded about closing the dampeners to reduce the supply of steam to the engines. Now, of course, I took that to mean, somewhat understandably, that meant the dampeners referred to some kind of steam valve between the boilers and the engines, because, hey, it's talking about, you close the dampeners, you reduce the supply of steam to the engines. And I'm thinking in engineering terms, well, you have the boilers and then you have the engines. So if you're reducing the supply of steam to the engines, there's got to be something in between the two. And what several people pointed out, that either through their studies or through the fact they still work with vertical triple expansion engines or some other similar kind of steam engine, like locomotive engines, the dampers are actually restricting the airflow to the boilers, which obviously then put into that context, it's still the statement in the account that I read still makes sense, because obviously if you are reducing the airflow to the boilers, they're not generating as much heat. If they're not generating as much heat, they're not generating as much steam. If they're not generating as much steam, then the steam pressure to the engines is reduced. This also makes logical sense, but it is not what I had inferred from reading the period account that I did. And so, that's from a position of more expert knowledge, they were able to inform me and everyone else who was reading the comments as to a somewhat more accurate explanation as to what exactly the dampeners were. The other type of discussion would be one where someone points me in the direction of a source where, I say, look, theoretically I could understand this, i.e. it's something perhaps more to do with the technical or tactical nature of naval history as opposed to perhaps the personal, but I just haven't been able to find either a good source or enough sources to be confident in saying anything particular. And then someone's gone, but what about this? And it might be a foreign language source, or it might be an obscure source in English that I just haven't heard about before. And then I'm going, yes, fantastic. I also really enjoy those, because whilst the explanations from people who are coming from a position of expertise are great, obviously, if someone turns around and says, well, if you want to know more about this thing and you haven't found a resource for it, this is where you need to go look. That means I can go look and find, hopefully, that resource. I can then get that resource. And then not only can I learn about the thing that I didn't feel I had enough knowledge about, but most of the time, those kind of books will contain other information which I didn't even know that I didn't know, or which supplements other stuff that I did know. And that's really good as well. And that wraps us up for this week. And if you're listening to this at the time of release, that means I have probably released the Drydock live into the wild, either from my hotel in Albany or from aboard the deck of USS Slater. So, retrospectively, to those of you who I have at the point of release of this video seen in Annapolis and USS Cod, thank you very much for coming. And also for those of you that I'm about to meet aboard USS Slater, thank you very much also for coming. And maybe some of you I'll see in what at the time of release of this video is a few days' time over in San Diego, who knows. And, well, thanks to everyone else who's listening to this video. And I hope to see you again in another video soon. Bye for now.